Hello and welcome. My name's Akash Paun. Thank you for watching this Institute for Government event in conversation with Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester. This is the third in our Elections 2021 event series, as part of which we're speaking with senior political figures from across the country in advance of the devolved and local elections that will be taking place on Thursday, the 6th of May. And among the posts up for election on that day are the so-called metro mayors of 7 city regions across England, including Greater Manchester, where our guest today, Andy Burnham, is seeking a second term in office, having been elected in the first set of elections for those posts back in 2017. For those unfamiliar with the term, metro mayors are directly elected leaders who hold responsibility for certain, sometimes quite difficult to define budgets, strategies, public services across a region that incorporates a number of different local council areas. And in the case of Greater Manchester, there are 10 council areas within the wider metro region that Andy Burnham represents. And the leaders of those 10 councils sit on a combined authority that is chaired by the mayor, and together the mayor and combined authority hold powers, often in partnership with central government, in policy areas including transport, housing and planning, health, justice, welfare and more. So we are really pleased to have the opportunity to talk through Andy Burnham's experience as mayor in trying to make a difference in some of those big policy areas over the past 4 years. Before becoming mayor, Andy was MP for Leigh in the Greater Manchester region. He held ministerial office in several different departments, including in Cabinet as Secretary of State for Culture and then for Health. He also served in the shadow cabinet after 2010. He's a lifelong fan of Everton Football Club, but the good people of Greater Manchester don't appear to hold that against him too much, as far as I'm aware. So I'm really pleased to have you with us, Andy. Thanks very much for taking the time to speak with us.
Oh, you're welcome, Akash. It's great to be able to look ahead to these elections, these mayoral elections with you, because I think they are important when it comes to the UK going forward, and it's an opportunity, of course, to reflect on what's working with English devolution and perhaps where it needs to go from here. But really great to join you this afternoon.
Great. So so we have about half an hour, well, just under now, for the conversation. I'll be putting a series of questions to Andy, but if you in the live audience would like to submit a question, then you can do that using the Q&A function on Microsoft Teams. And you can also like questions proposed by others if you think they are particularly worthy of consideration. So let's get straight into it. So Andy, you've been in post for coming up to 4 years now. What have been the highlights of your period in office so far?
So yes, 4 years, Akash, and I think the highlight for me is the liberation of working in this way and not being part of the Westminster system, which, if I'm honest, I increasingly fell out of love with. I mean, there's so much more I can say about that. I think the difference between that and what I'm doing now is the way you can sort of start from the bottom and build up from the bottom and make change happen sort of with people rather than imposing it on people. It's such a different way of working, and it's actually more empowering. And the highlights you asked me to touch on, if I pick out one or two, I made a commitment around homelessness when I stood for election in 2017, and I wasn't sure that I could pull off what we have in fact done, which is to oversee a massive reduction in the number of people sleeping rough. And the reason why it's a highlight is because it really has been a whole system approach, all public services kind of buying into the idea of getting a reduction. And I think, you know, it is an example of how you can make change happen by asking public services to prioritise the issue, number one, but to work in a very different way. And I could probably say a little more about that. But just on a simple level, I promised young people a free bus pass, and there are now 70,000 16 to 18-year-olds in Greater Manchester wandering around with a little piece of plastic in their pocket, which I like to think of as a passport to opportunities that they wouldn't have had had I not been in post. So those are highlights. I increasingly in my political career, I just became more and more interested in making real change and becoming less and less interested in the point scoring side of politics. And I think sometimes in Westminster, the point scoring takes over everything, and you can lose sight of what it's all about when you're just trapped in that very, sort of adversarial system. So I'm quite liberated doing what I'm doing. I think it is connecting politics maybe to people a bit better. And I do see it as part of civic and political renewal, the whole drive towards devolution in England. And I really hope it's just at the end of the beginning, not at the beginning of the end.
Yeah, well, the homelessness example is an interesting one, and I know that's been a big priority of yours in the way that you describe. But it's interesting because it's not an area where, when the devolution deals were initially done and the post was created, where it was seen that would be a function of the mayor. And I mean, my understanding of it is that most of the levers to actually deal with the problem of homelessness in Greater Manchester sit elsewhere, whether with the councils or with central government, or you've worked with private sector providers and so on as well. So what's been the distinct role that you have played to make a difference in that area, which I guess gets at the point of like, what is the purpose of the role of Metro Mayor within this quite complicated landscape of agencies and government departments and local bodies as well?
Yes, you're right. It wasn't technically within my list of competencies, and there are two ways you could go about this job. I think some mayors do stick more strictly, if you like, to the areas where they have defined role. I've taken the view that this will only succeed. This it's always still an experiment of devolution in England if it really adds value and can speak to all of the things that people are worried about, and also uses the convening power of the mayor. Now, this is the bit that really shouldn't be underestimated. I think it's huge to have one person within a city region like Greater Manchester who is able to bring people together, and certainly in a city region like ours, agree a common mission about something that matters to people. And homelessness was absolutely right up there when we stood for the first mayoral elections in 2017. So what have I been able to do about it? I do chair something called the Greater Manchester Reform Board, which is a unique body, I think, in English public service, in that it brings together all of the local and national bodies that are working within Greater Manchester, together with the voluntary and community sector. So the Reform Board is a forum which I chair. It isn't a statutory body, but it allows one conversation to take place over issues that are of concern. And I had identified rough sleeping early on. And it's amazing actually what's happened, as I was saying, the extent to which Greater Manchester Police and our NHS have bought into the mission, and some of the changes they've made as a result, really inspiring stuff. But we've also kind of used that to mobilise a wider fundraising initiative. You may remember that the former captain of Manchester City Football Club, Vincent Kompany, dedicated his testimonial year to it. And once you do something like that, it's amazing what more happens, and how you start to make it more than the sum of its parts. Yeah. And that certainly, I think, is what happened with homelessness in Greater Manchester. And the mayor can play a massive role in bringing people together, galvanising people, lifting their level of ambition. So the convening power of the role really shouldn't be underestimated. Yeah.
Okay. No, that's very interesting, and this gets at this question of soft power versus hard power, and we'll come on in a few minutes to the question of whether you think more formal powers should be devolved now, or how far you can get with the powers you already have. But before we get onto that, I also just wanted to ask the well, the opposite of my first question, really, which is we talked about the highlights, but what are the mistakes you think you've made? I mean, are there episodes you look back on now and think, oh, I really wish I'd handled that differently?
I guess in some ways the expectations that people have of the role are, you know, because I haven't sold people a sort of reduced version of it, if you know what I mean. I did put a very expansive manifesto forward at the outset. I guess I built expectations that have been challenging to deliver. I don't think I've ever worked harder, if I'm honest with you, than in my last 4 years. And when you are, I suppose, out there on different things, you almost become responsible for things that you're not responsible for, if that makes sense. You know, if anything goes wrong in Greater Manchester, now people will hit my Twitter timeline and blame me for it, or, you know, so I guess, you know, would I have done it slightly differently going forward and being clearer about what I was responsible for and what I'm not? It's a difficult one because, you know, if we'd had too much a boiled down version of devolution, I'm not sure people would have bought into it. I think what people have bought into is the idea that Greater Manchester can make changes for itself that deviate from national policy, and people like that. You know, they want more of that, if anything. Yeah. So I guess looking back, you know, particularly transport, I think has been the biggest challenge, where I'm only responsible for a really small part of the system, the tram system. You know, the buses are deregulated, the trains, you know, privatized. You know, it's a very fragmented system when you look at transport outside of London and the other English cities, and the extent to which, I mean, the one thing that I did provide when I came into office was people had one person to complain to about this underperforming transport system. So in some ways, it's kind of, you know, given a focal point within the system, but yeah, it's challenging then to, given the very fragmented nature of transport, to actually get it to move in the direction that you want it to move in.
Right, yeah, because I know you've, on transport specifically, sorry, just to, I wanted to ask about this. So I know you've, through Transport for Greater Manchester, have published ambitious strategy documents setting out a vision for much more integrated public transport system, you know, net carbon emissions and all that kind of thing by 2040, which, you know, looks and sounds great, and I can see why it would excite a lot of people. But I guess what you're saying is, when it comes down to it, you don't, at least at present, really have all the necessary powers and resources to make that happen. So does that mean on that kind of subject, your role is more to build the coalition of support behind it, and then to lobby the centre for, when it comes down to it, the money to pay for the things you'd like to see happen?
It's certainly quite a lot of that. I think English cities outside of London are nowhere near punching their weight at the moment. And I think transport is an obvious example of how they don't, you know, pull their weight. It's very fragmented, poor quality offer, and, you know, most unlike what you find in most of the European cities when you go there. So doing something about transport, I think, is mission critical for a city like Greater Manchester. And actually, we did argue as part of the original devolution deal with George Osborne for greater power to control the transport system. So we have the Bus Services Act 2017, an Act of Parliament, which was the price. George Osborne's price of a devolution deal was that he wanted a mayor, which the other 10 leaders repeatedly tell me that they weren't massively keen on at the time. And their price, back to George Osborne, was the ability to take control of buses. And, you know, I think it's often remarked that the only reason that they tolerate my presence is because they wanted the Bus Services Act 2017 to create some options over reform of buses. So that's the only reason they put up with the mayor. So Greater Manchester did win powers to kind of reform its bus system. In the original devolution deal, there was reference to us taking control of our train stations. And we have recently actually just taken control of our first, Horwich Parkway station. So the vision is to take more control of the system, if you like, to make it more like a London style system. You know, now whether we do that through an enhanced partnership that is proposed by the Bus Services Act, or a franchising system, we're about to make a decision on that, so that's not finalised at the moment. But transport in Greater Manchester is going to change, and I would say I've got sort of some, but not all, of the powers I need to make sure that that is successful. So it will require further lobbying of central government as well.
Yeah. And so in terms of that relationship with central government, then, I mean, we saw the budget, of course, just last week, and that seemed to include quite a lot of announcements and different funding streams to support regions such as Greater Manchester. There's a levelling up fund, a towns fund, a community renewal fund. There's going to be a shared prosperity fund. You know, the numbers are in the billions when you add them all together, at least for England as a whole. But what was your overall take on the budget? I mean, was that not a good news budget for Greater Manchester, given all those announcements, or are you overall sceptical of the government's approach?
I think I described it as a packet of polos budget, refreshing but full of holes. Is, you know, refreshing in some ways, and it was with some of the things that were put forward. But actually, I mean, I saw a lot missing in the budget, and what I see as missing is a commitment to true devolution, which the government began by promising when it was talking about levelling up, but seems to be going, and they're moving back towards very traditional Whitehall bidding rounds, which, you know, I find infuriating, if I'm honest. It's the tyranny of bidding, the bidding culture, you know, areas putting forward bids, the time that goes into this. Devolved funding is what we need. You know, when we have devolved capital funding, we can make quicker decisions and we can make quicker progress on levelling up. And I think we need to get back to that as a guiding principle. I think the danger with the way the government are going is it feels like it's being scattered now to favoured places, you know, a bit of funding here, and for whatever reason that you're plucking out this town but not that one. And I don't think that will create the conditions in which levelling up will succeed, because it's quite divisive, number one, because it's, you know, winners and losers. And I think levelling up needs to sort of keep a sense of it being about everybody and everywhere. That will help it if that's what it's about. But secondly, you lose the ability to make more strategic investment decisions in that context when it's a bidding round. You know, the bigger infrastructure pieces that will actually level up the north of England seem to be sort of being pushed to the side, and it's the sort of, you know, very typically Whitehall controlled process that I don't personally believe you can level up top down. I think the only way you level up is giving more power to places to make more decisions for themselves. And I think that's increasingly missing from the government's narrative now.
So what specific reforms would you like to see then in terms of how you and the combined authority are funded from the centre? What's your ideal model for that?
It's more long-term devolved funding. You know, the shared prosperity fund that we were promised, you know, which was a replacement for European funds, should have been constructed on that basis, and yet it too seems to be going down a bidding path. I just think, from my experience, devolution will return maximum dividends once it can be done with true buy-in at a local level, where people are setting their own priorities at a local level, where there is trust in places to do that. For me, you get most back from devolution the more you buy into it. You know, half-hearted versions of it, I personally don't think work. I think the greatest returns come when you completely buy into the place-based approach. What we've shown, I think, in Greater Manchester is you can break down the silos between different public services. You can, as I said before, create one conversation about big priorities across the city region. If you take the green agenda, I think the country is going to need the big cities to move faster on zero carbon if it's to be likely that the UK as a whole will hit 2050. You aren't going to get to that by top-down intervention. You just won't. You won't hit it. You're going to have to combine backstop legislation on the things everybody must do with freeing up those who want to move fastest and be the earliest adopters. You know, that is the way this is going to have to work. You know, kind of, yes, fallback positions legislated, but actually freeing up those who want to be the early adopters. And I think we're in danger of missing that side of it. If the UK PLC is going to recover from this, we need to be firing on all cylinders coming out of the pandemic, using every bit of capacity in the system, in local government, regional government, national government. My worry is during this last year, we've gone back to a sort of mentality that the centre knows everything, the centre can run everything. And as we've discovered, it can't actually.
Yeah. Well, you, as mentioned in the introduction, have been a minister in the centre. I mean, can you appreciate why ministers and Whitehall departments might be reluctant to let go of control of some of these funds and policy areas if they feel, for example, that they're still going to get blamed when things go wrong? Well,
I don't know. I just think it's a very territorial thing. I think that Whitehall doesn't like necessarily giving up power. There's a degree of arrogance there that Whitehall always does things better than everyone else. But I would say if you take an issue like technical education, that's clearly not true. It's never run it properly. It's never come up with a good solution for vocational technical education. So the argument for Whitehall just keeping the status quo really doesn't work to me. And if you ask me the difference between my old job and my new job, so the way I describe it is this, as a cabinet minister, particularly as health secretary, when you're looking with a telescope out from your department at the rest of the country, you can see numbers but not names. As Mayor of Greater Manchester, I can see names, not numbers, if you know what I mean, in that I'm closer to the ground, and you can kind of work on a whole person, whole family, whole community approach to policy in a way that you simply cannot do in Whitehall. You can join the dots between the different government silos, and you can actually make services much more effective for people. And I think if Whitehall learned to let go a bit, it would realise that a place-based approach rather than a silo-based approach would actually end up delivering better results for the public and would spend public money much more efficiently than we currently do.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm conscious of time, and we've got loads of really good questions coming in. So I want to throw in a couple of questions from the audience, building on what we were just talking about, actually. So first of all, there's a question from Holly Day, which I'm not convinced is whether that's a real name or not, but never mind.
We can all do with one.
So it's possible. Anyway, thanks for the question. Question being, what are you expecting from the government's long anticipated devolution white paper, which has been promised and delayed a number of times? And I think I'll combine that with a question from Robert Morland, which is, do you believe from your experience that the mayoral system such as yours should cover all of the country, and or should there be a system of regional government? So in other words, what are you expecting from the government's white paper if that ever emerges, and should we be looking towards a much more sort of uniform approach to devolution across England?
Yeah, I'm becoming less optimistic about it, Holly, if I'm honest. There seems to be a move away from it, and just because I sort of stood up to the government and stood up for Greater Manchester last year, it would be very disappointing if Whitehall thinks, well, we're not having people doing that, therefore we're pulling back on devolution. We've got to have a more mature relationship between central government and local government, a greater balance between those two things. So I hope it's not the end of the commitment. I would like to see control over post-16 education, as I was just saying. I think there is much more evidence that if you link it to local economies, you can build a more successful skills system. I would like greater control over the DWP budget. Again, I think we're proving we can spend that better when we do it in a more bottom-up approach. We have twice the success rate on getting people into work through the work programme than the traditional top-down approach. More power over transport, I think, would absolutely help English cities punch their weight and be more like cities that we see around the world. Mm-hmm. Yes, Robert, I think you asked the second question. We need to fill in this map. And the thing about this devolution that I'm working with is different to devolution to Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. That is top-down devolution. This devolution is different. where you've got 10 councils, as Akash said at the start, part of a combined authority. That is really building from the bottom up. And it's better than the London model, actually, where the GLA isn't connected to the councils, whereas the GMCA is the councils. So if we agree on something in Greater Manchester, the whole of the system can move in that direction. And that's why it's a powerful system. And personally, I think in the 21st century, change is more likely to be driven bottom up rather than top down. I think top down approach to running things is a 20th century kind of old fashioned state model. I think when we look at the challenge around decarbonisation, digitalisation, whatever you look at as the sort of big 21st century issue, it's more likely to succeed driven bottom up, I think. And I think the form of devolution we have in Greater Manchester allows that to happen. UK PLC, I think, will be wise to free up its regions, its big cities, to allow them to be big more than they currently are when it comes to the to the impact they make on the world stage. We're so London dominated at the moment, and I think we are missing a very big trick in not empowering our cities to be more than they are.
Okay, and another question just wanted to put to you. So this is from Vernon Bogdanor, and it's specifically about health and social care devolution, which is an area where Greater Manchester has devolved control of a big budget in a way that doesn't apply to most of the other city regions. So the question is, does this work well in the case of Manchester, and is this a model that could be applied easily to the rest of the country?
I think I wouldn't want to overclaim, Vernon, but I think it does work well in that we are seeing moves towards a much more integrated, not just health and social care system, but the health service more integrated with wider public services. And the example I gave before on homelessness is valid, because I said to the health service when I came into office that it needed to take a responsibility on this issue, because it spends a lot of money on smoking or obesity. But when we look at rough sleeping, there are people whose health is visibly deteriorating in front of our eyes. And yet the health service traditionally has not seen that as an issue for health. And to be fair to them, they originally resisted, but then said, OK, we accept it, and came on board. And I think the health service can be a driver for change in a much bigger canvas than when it just remains as a sort of treatment service. I think the lesson of the pandemic is that health is built or isn't built in people's homes, in people's workplaces, in people's communities. And the health service needs to start working with other public services to do that, to build health and resilience in all of those places, and think differently about how health is created. And I think the health service is, if it stays in its current model, is kind of trapped in a treatment model, which is again a very 20th century notion. It needs to break out of that, working with other public services into a health promotion service. And I think we've got emerging evidence in Greater Manchester that our model allows that to happen.
Okay, great. All right. Well, the clock is ticking. One final question, changing the subject somewhat to national politics. So, I mean, you stood to become leader of the Labour Party before you got this new job, and it sounds like you're maybe happy that you ended up where you are. But my question is, why do you think Labour is still so far behind in recent opinion polls? And what do you think Sir Keir Starmer, as leader of Labour, should do differently to try and close that gap?
I think it's been an exceptionally difficult time for Keir to take over as leader, coming into a national crisis. I think it's going to be hard for a leader of opposition, to do right from doing wrong. People would say if he was too challenging, that wasn't right at this moment in time, or not challenging enough. Others will say the same. So it's kind of hard to find the right balance, but I think he has found the right balance. There's a lot of rebuilding to do. But I think Labour, in my view, is making a mistake by not more enthusiastically embracing devolution. I think all political parties have got to get themselves out of the mindset that Westminster is the be all and end all. Labour's got this mindset that we wait 4 or 5 years and then we try everything on a Westminster election. And I don't think that's the way we're going to sort of succeed. I think we need to get better at building from the bottom up, and rethinking politics. I think we've got to break out of some of the stale old tribal point scoring ways of Westminster politics. And I don't think Labour yet has put forward a vision for how it can kind of reconnect at that sort of very bottom up sort of level. So I think Keir's made all the right first moves, but I think it's an exceptionally challenging time. But I think Labour really does now need to rethink some of the ways it works. And it needs almost to define levelling up itself and take it off the government. I think the government is going wrong with levelling up now. It is becoming quite a divisive sort of partial agenda. Levelling up, to me, starts with people rather than infrastructure. And certainly after the pandemic, it should all be about, starting with the poorest people in the poorest places and building a vision for how they can be truly lifted up from where they are. And then we devolve more power to those places to do more for themselves. I think we're still a bit stuck in the sort of Westminster centric mindset, if I'm honest, the Labour Party, and it needs to break out of it. Okay.
Great, thanks very much. So we are at 2:45. There are a lot more questions, but Andy, do you need to call this to a close at this point?
No, I can carry on for a little longer if that helps, I think.
Okay, sorry to like drop that on you, but yeah, very grateful. I'm just keen to bring in some more members of the audience. So, okay, so where is that question? So there was a question then from someone called S. Lyons about the spatial framework for Manchester. So this is your plan for where to build housing and other infrastructure over the coming years. It's an area where there's been disagreement, I know, with some of the local councils. And one of the 10, namely Stockport, I believe, voted to reject the spatial framework, and as a result, it can't go forward in the original version because you need unanimity. I mean, the original question was, are you excited about the spatial framework and how that will change the face of Manchester? But I guess my supplementary is, well, what went wrong? Why could you not get the full unanimity across the 10 councils?
It is going forward as a plan of 9 councils, so it's not completely derailed. It is still moving forward as a strategic plan. What went wrong? I think local politics, I'm afraid, intervened, particularly with a May election on the horizon. Stockport is always a quite borderline council. There isn't an overall control situation, and I just think that's basically local politics intruded on it, unfortunately. The thing about spatial framework was it actually benefited Stockport in that it allowed it to build below its housing need because Manchester and Salford were building above, and the redistributive side of it, if I'm honest, I don't think we ever communicated as well as we should. But I am excited about it, to answer the question. I'm actually excited about what's happening in Stockport. I don't know if this is well understood, but Stockport has the first mayoral development corporation in the country that's focused on a town centre. It's chaired by Lord Kerslake, and we're looking at building 3,500 new homes in town centre Stockport under the famous railway arches. And I believe this will be a model of town centre regeneration that in the end will surpass anything achieved by the Towns Fund or the Levelling Up Fund, because it's a very strategic, coordinated master plan linked to reformed public transport, better cycling and walking infrastructure. I've got really high hopes actually for what we will achieve in Stockport. It's obviously based on a urban renewal, brownfield preference approach, and I think what it will do is it will end up building more affordable homes, higher density homes linked to public transport, taking away redundant retail economic capacity. I think this is what needs to happen to towns across the country. We need to replace retail with residential and rethink them as places where people want to live. And I'm really excited about what is actually emerging in Stockport, even though they pulled away from the plan overall, the Stockport Mayoral Development Corporation is, I think, going to set a template for town centre regeneration across the country.
Okay, great. All right, a couple more, if we may. Thanks very much for your time. So this is a question on the Q&A from someone who is anonymous, which is about Whitehall. So quite a good sort of IFG question. How can Whitehall become more representative? So is the answer jobs and departments moving out of London, or is it people from different backgrounds moving in? And I think I'll link that back to, we were talking a bit about the budget before, and one of the interesting announcements in the budget was that a good chunk of Treasury staff would be relocated to the north of England, but specifically to Darlington. So I wonder if you have any observations about that particular announcement as well.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both, isn't it? I think it's about opening up clearer pathways for young people from all parts of the country to work in the civil service, but also certainly about taking government departments out. And the example I want to point to, Akash, is GCHQ. So they have recently moved to Manchester explicitly for its diversity and for our ability to feed them with a talent pipeline that comes from places that they can't reach from Cheltenham, and perspectives and backgrounds. And I think it's to their great credit. They are really working hard to build connections with schools and to excite people about cyber and tech, because they recognise, rightly in my view, that to be a world-class intelligence and security service in this century, you need to employ people from all walks of life and therefore have all perspectives on life within the organisation. And I do contrast GCHQ's move to Manchester with the BBC's move to Salford a decade ago, which I oversaw as Culture Secretary. To say it was a little grudging when the BBC came would be a bit of an understatement, actually. And it was very much the BBC was relocating all of the people, whereas GCHQ have come in a much more, I would say, enthusiastic way about taking advantage of Greater Manchester talent. And I think they are a real example for Whitehall to look at. I would implore every Whitehall department to look at what GCHQ have done. I think it's bold, I think it's right, and it certainly, I think, will improve, never mind Manchester, it will improve GCHQ going forward.
Yeah.
Actually, as the BBC was improved by the move to Salford, if the BBC had not done that, there wouldn't be the same level range of accents on the airwaves now. And I think the BBC would be perceived as more ivory tower than it currently is. I think it is, the move to Salford has opened up the BBC to more people.
So Whitehall should learn from this, is what you're saying.
I think it gives organisations greater legitimacy. When you are a national organisation, you need to be of the whole country.
Yeah.
And I think there are real lessons from what GCHQ have done.
Okay. And what did you think about Darlington being chosen as the location for Treasury North? Was that, do you think, based on a solid sort of assessment of the economic benefits, or was this to some extent helping your Metro Mayor counterpart Ben Houchen, Conservative Mayor of Tees Valley, with his re-election campaign?
God, that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I don't have the evidence to say that it was a political move. I think it's a surprise that an organisation like the Treasury is not, if we're honest, in a city centre. Not saying it would have been Manchester, but Leeds or Newcastle. And the danger for me is sometimes when organisations, go to places that haven't got that wider infrastructure around, it makes you wonder whether the move will be successful. I hope it is. And I'm absolutely delighted for Darlington, but I think it would have been more likely to succeed had it gone to Newcastle or say Leeds or even Durham. I don't know, but that would have been more likely, because what I think happens is that you get a clustering effect, don't you? And certainly we're seeing that with GCHQ at the moment. We're seeing cyber organisations coming in around, and obviously we've got an infrastructure that can sustain a cluster. Whether you can do that in a smaller town, I don't know. So I'm not sure that it will have the impact that it could have had the Treasury moved to a different northern city. So I think we've got to be careful with these things. They can be done in the right way. Done in the wrong way, they can set the whole notion. They can set the whole notion back. And yeah. I would be honest and say I was surprised at the choice of location.
Okay, thanks very much. All right, very final one, I promise. Keith MacDonald, the very first person to suggest a question, so I feel it's only right to put that to you. What would be the effect on the north of England if Scotland left the UK?
Oh, I think it would be very damaging. I think, because the north of England actually probably has more affinity with Scotland on some issues than it does with other parts of England, and there are there are long established relationships. I think it would create a sense of dislocation for the north if it happened. The only way of looking at it, of course, it probably would make Whitehall reassess things with regard to its plan for the north. When I was Chief Secretary of the Treasury, Joel Barnett, he of the Barnett formula, came to see me, pleading with me to scrap the Barnett formula. And I have said before that it's the first time a politician, in my experience, has ever asked for something that carries his or her name to be scrapped. It's a very unique thing. But he came to me and said very explicitly the Barnett formula was unfair to the north of England because of the way it skews funding around the UK. And look, English spending is carefully concentrated in London, and I think that is a problem. And I think if Scotland left the UK, I think the issue about the north and the investment in the north would I think become very much into the spotlight. You might say it might force the Treasury to seriously rethink how it distributes funding across England, but I think that might be a benefit, but I think we would lose more in terms of the fracturing of relationships. I think it would lead to a sense of dislocation in the wider north. So I really hope it doesn't happen. But obviously we're in challenging times, aren't we? In terms of I think the best answer, my appeal would be for the country to back what Gordon Brown is saying, and that's to move to a more federal UK, where the English regions, alongside Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, have a much greater degree of power. But I would also ask the Welsh government and the Scottish government to consider devolving more power within their own countries as well, to create the conditions where, let's say, the North West could work more with North Wales on a devolved basis. I think that will create a healthier approach to politics all over the country. I'll finish on this point, Akash. What I have found leaving Westminster is, Westminster puts politics first, place second. When you leave there and come into the role I'm in, where it's place first, it's by definition a unifying force. It brings people together from wherever they're coming from, and it's a much healthier starting point for conversations about politics, about change. Place is a unifying factor. And I think British politics would be in a better position if there was more devolved power at regional level, not just in England, but across all of the UK. And it would allow more places to work collaboratively with each other, even over borders. And it becomes more about people and communities and places, less about the things that divide us on big picture political lines. So I don't know whether the future of these islands is bound up with a vision of that kind, but I sincerely hope that it is, because I think we've come to a pretty poor place, really, where we are very, very divided if you look across the UK as a whole. Levelling up is actually the right thing. The government's hit on the right theme. It would be such a shame now if it turns into a divisive fight. I just hope that we can get it back on track, and I hope the devolution white paper can be true to what it originally promised. But thank you for your questions this afternoon. Great. Thanks for everybody tuning in. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks. Yeah, thanks so much for your time and for sticking around longer than planned. Quick commercial break. You mentioned the Barnett formula. The Institute for Government has a new report out on the Barnett formula, which concludes that the north of England and other poorer areas like the Midlands are underfunded, and Scotland and in particular Scotland does disproportionately well out of the distribution of funding. So definitely in favour of reform there. So all that remains for me to say is, yeah, once again, thank you, Andy. Thank you, everyone else, for tuning in. Apologies to Holly Day for doubting your identity. I see on the chat that that is your name, so I do apologise for that. There will be more devolution events and content coming out over the next couple of months. Hope you join us all. You will join us again. Thanks. Bye bye.